Amritam tapta jivanam kavibidiritam kalmashapaham Shravanamangalam Srimadatam Bhuviganantiye Bhurida Janaha. Welcome everyone to tonight's class on the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. The topic today is, was Sri Ramakrishna a Vishishtadvaitan? Was he a follower of Ramanuja's school of Vishishtadvaita? The question arises because there's an extremely interesting 1.5-page entry in the original Bengali version of the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, the Sri Ramakrishna Kathamrita, authored by Medhananda Gupta. In this 1.5-page entry in the original Bengali, first of all, that entry is called Shevak Hridaye, in the heart of a sevaka, of a servant, of whom? Of Sri Ramakrishna. Medhananda Gupta was a very humble person. So even though he was the author of the book, he often referred to himself, instead of saying I, he would refer to himself as sevak in other terms. So this whole 1.5-page section are his own personal thoughts and reflections about Sri Ramakrishna's teachings. And strikingly, Swami Nikhilanandaji, who is the great translator of the Kathamrita into English, he omits the entire 1.5-page entry. We don't find it at all in the English translation. And you might ask why, and I can only give a speculative answer to that, but the first reason might be that Nikhilanandaji may have felt, look, the whole purpose of this book is to highlight Sri Ramakrishna's teachings and his interactions with others, but why should we also give space to M's thoughts about these things? Because the book is not about M. M is recording his teachings, but that might have been one reason. And the second reason, maybe that Nikhilanandaji may have disagreed with some of the reflections in this section. So these are just some speculative thoughts. But in any case, I wanted to focus on one particular passage in this 1.5-page entry. The entry occurs, I'll mention it for the sake of people who know Bengali and read the original Bengali. It's on pages 697 to 698 of the Bengali Kathamrita in the standard 1-volume Udbodhan edition of the Bengali Gospel, after the 26th October 1884 entry. Okay? Then you get this 1.5-page entry called In the Heart of a Servant, and it's M's reflections on Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, and Nikhilanandaji does not include any of it. And just for the benefit of those of you watching online, as always, I have a handout, a sort of double-sided handout, and you can download the handout under the YouTube description. So, the first quotation on the handout is this paragraph that I want to focus on from this 1.5-page entry, which is only found in the original Bengali Kathamrita. So obviously it's my own translation. M says, so Medhananda Gupta says, Thakur, Sri Ramakrishna, does not say that this universe is unreal like a dream. He says, if we say so, then the weight of the bale fruit will fall short. His view is not the doctrine of Maya, meaning that doctrine of Maya of Advaita Vedanta. Rather, his view is the doctrine of Vishishtadvaita, qualified non-dualism, since he does not dismiss the world and individual souls as unreal and illusory. God is real, and people are real, and the world is real as well. Brahman is qualified by Jiva, the individual soul, and Jagat, the world of names and forms. You cannot get the full weight of the bale fruit if you exclude the seeds and shell. If among those of you who know Bengali, you can flip to the second page of the handout, the back side, and that has the original Bengali. I'll read it just because it's short. Thakur ei jagat স্বপ্নবৎ bolchen na. Bolen tahole ojone kom pore, মায়াবাদ নয়, বিশিষ্টাদ্বৈতবাদ। কেননা জীব জগৎ অলিক বলছেন না, মনের ভুল বলছেন না, ঈশ্বর সত্য, আবার মানুষ সত্য, জগৎ সত্য, জীব জগৎ বিশিষ্ট ব্রহ্ম, বিচি খোলা বাদ দিলে সব বেলটা পাওয়া যায় না. So that's the original Bengali. Bengali is such a succinct language that it takes almost twice the amount of words in English to translate the passage. Okay, now, this is a pretty explosive statement because these issues are extremely controversial. Exactly what was Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy? And M takes a very strong stand here, and he says that Thakur Sri Ramakrishna is best understood as a Vishishtadvaitan. And so I find it surprising that this passage, even among those who can read Bengali, the monks in the order, devotees in the order, scholars who can read Bengali, they don't discuss this much. There's one exception, which I want to point you to. Swami Prabhanandaji, who's a very senior vice president of our order, he's in Belumut now. He's a very good researcher and scholar himself, and he wrote an article called, it's in Bangla, so again, unfortunately, if you don't know Bangla, all these things are sort of not accessible to you. But in any case, the Bengali title is Kathamrite Sri Ramakrishna Mot Ki Vishishtadvaita Bad. So the title is a question. In the Kathamrita, in the Gospel, is the philosophy of Sri Ramakrishna Vishishtadvaita? Ramanuja's doctrine. That's the title of the article. It's a very interesting article, full of a lot of unknown information. I just want to throw out one. This surprised me. This is the only place where I've ever heard this. In this Bengali article written by Swami Prabhanandaji, he mentions that both two direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, Swami Premanandaji and Swami Abhedanandaji, both said, I'll read the exact Bangla, which it's a direct quotation. Thakur chilen Vishishtadvaitabadi. The translation being, Thakur, Sri Ramakrishna, was a Vishishtadvaitan. That means it was not just M who believed this. Two of Sri Ramakrishna's future monastic disciples, Premananda and Abhedananda, both said the same thing. Thakur chilen Vishishtadvaitabadi. Thakur was a Vishishtadvaitan. So that information I got from Prabhanandaji's article, and he cites an Udbodan article. Udbodan is our Bengali journal based in Kolkata. I haven't looked up the original source, so I can't vouch for it, but Prabhanandaji is a meticulous researcher, so I'm taking what he says as true. Okay, so with that said, it's important to recognize that not all of the direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna agreed with this judgment. Another great direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna, namely Swami Turiyanandaji, held a different view. There's a wonderful Bengali letter, 2-page Bengali letter, again Bengali, sorry for this, Bengali letter in which Swami Turiyanandaji, in response to a question from Swami Sharvanandaji, another monk, that monk asks, what was Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy and how does it relate to Shankara's Advaita philosophy? And Turiyanandaji in response writes a beautiful 2-page letter. And Turiyanandaji's main argument is that Sri Ramakrishna harmonizes all of the different Vedantic sects, including Shankara's Advaita and Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita, and he mentions even non-Vedantic sects within Hinduism, so Tantra, Shaktadvaita, these things. And because his philosophy is a very broad, harmonizing philosophy, it cannot be pigeonholed into any one of the existing traditions, philosophical traditions. This was Swami Turiyanandaji's argument. Stay tuned on December 15th. I'll be giving a class called Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam, Swami Turiyananda on Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy, where I'm going to discuss this letter, this Bengali letter in detail, and attempting to retranslate parts of it myself. So what I want to do today is discuss this very, very interesting and provocative passage from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, actually not from the Gospel, because the Gospel is the English translation, but from the Kathamrita, the Bengali version. M's thought that Sri Ramakrishna was a Vishishtadvaitan rather than an Advaita Vedantan. And my overall argument is that I think he's wrong, and I think that instead Swami Turiyanandaji has the more accurate interpretation, that Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy cannot be pigeonholed into either Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita sect or Shankara's Advaita Vedanta because it's broader than all of them and because it harmonizes the different sects of Vedanta. So first of all, I wanted to point out, first of all, regarding this passage, this first passage on the handout, there are 3 points I want to make. There are 3 points M makes, which I agree with. I think he's right about them. So the first point he makes, which I fully agree with, is he says that Sri Ramakrishna does not dismiss this world as unreal. I think he's absolutely right about that. Second point on which I agree with M, on the basis of this first claim, Sri Ramakrishna does not dismiss this world as unreal, M infers that Sri Ramakrishna's view is different from what he calls in Bengali Mayavada, by which he means Shankara's classical Advaita Vedanta, according to which Brahman alone is true and Jagat is mithya, the world is unreal. So I think M is also right in claiming that Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy differs from Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, which holds Brahma Satyam Jagat mithya. And there's a third point on which I agree with M. M also says in the same passage that according to Sri Ramakrishna, God is real, individual souls are real, and this world of names and forms is also real. I think he's absolutely right about that as well. So I'm not saying he's completely wrong. I just think that his final conclusion that Sri Ramakrishna was Vishishtadvaita, I think, is mistaken. But he's right about a lot of things, in my opinion. So where are the two places where I think that M is mistaken? First, I think he's mistaken in claiming that Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy was Vishishtadvaita Vedanta. And I'm going to say more about that shortly. And secondly, I think that there's a more fundamental problem. It seems as if M is reasoning as follows. He says that, well, Thakur does not dismiss this world as unreal, so therefore he was not a Shankarite, therefore he must have been a Ramanujite. As if there are only two possibilities. As if there are only these two traditional schools, and Sri Ramakrishna has to be thrown into one of these camps. And I think that's a mistake too. I think the possibility that M overlooks is that Sri Ramakrishna, of course, Sri Ramakrishna was an avatara. Of course, M also accepted that. But Sri Ramakrishna, when an avatara comes, when God comes in the form of a human being, it shouldn't be surprising if the avatara comes and says something new. God doesn't come in human form just to repeat the same old, same old. So I think that the possibility that M overlooks is that Sri Ramakrishna propounded a new harmonizing philosophy, one that harmonizes all of the different Vedantic traditions, including Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita, Madhva's Dvaita Vedanta, otherwise known as Madhva Vedanta, harmonizes Tantra, harmonizes Vaishnavism, and even harmonizes non-Hindu religions like Christianity and Islam. As I said, this was Swami Turiyananji's understanding of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy, and this is the view that I want to develop today in the class. But first of all, let's go one step at a time. We might ask, what led M to think that Sri Ramakrishna was a Vishishtadvaitan, a follower of Ramanuja's school? I think the main reason is that Sri Ramakrishna himself explicitly likens his own philosophy to the philosophy of Ramanuja in many places in the Gospel. And I want to point to one such example. This is from the entry from 11th March 1885. It's the second dialogue in the handout on the first page. Sri Ramakrishna says, and Swami Vivekananda was in the room at the time, he says, there is the Vedanta as explained by Shankara. There's also Ramanuja's doctrine of Vishishtadvaita. Now, this is my translation of this sentence. The reason being that I disagree with Nikhilanandaji's translation. Let me read the original Bangla. Bedanto, Shankar ja bujiyechen tao ache, abar Ramanujet Vishishtadvaita bado ache. And I'm going to explain a bit later why I have given my own translation here. But again, Sri Ramakrishna, there is the Vedanta as explained by Shankara. There's also Ramanuja's doctrine of Vishishtadvaita. Narendra, what is Vishishtadvaita? Sri Ramakrishna. Vishishtadvaita is Ramanuja's doctrine. According to this view, Brahman is qualified by the universe and its living beings. These three, Brahman, the insentient world, and living beings, together constitute one reality. Jeev Jagat Bishishto Brahma Shab Joriya Ekti. Take the instance of a bale fruit. A man wanted to know the weight of the fruit. He separated the shell, the flesh, and the seeds. But can a man get the weight of the whole fruit by weighing only the flesh? He must weigh flesh, shell, and seeds together. At first it appears that the real thing in the fruit is the flesh and not its seeds or shell. Then by reasoning you find that the shell, seeds, and flesh all belong to the fruit. The shell and seeds belong to the same thing that the flesh belongs to. Likewise, in spiritual discrimination, one must first reason following the method of not this, neti, neti. God is not the universe. God is not the living beings. Brahman alone is real, and all else is unreal. Then one realizes, as with the bale fruit, that the reality from which we derive the notion of Brahman is the very reality from which come living beings and the universe. The Nitya and the Leela are the two aspects of one and the same reality. Therefore, Ramanuja held that Brahman is qualified by the universe and the living beings. This is called Vishishtadvaita. Then then M adds 2M. Sri Ramakrishna now directly addresses M. Sri Ramakrishna says, I do see God directly. What shall I reason about? I clearly see that she herself, the Divine Mother herself, has become everything. That she herself has become the universe and all living beings. So, coming back to the first sentence, Sri Ramakrishna's first statement. There is the Vedanta as explained by Shankara. There's also Ramanuja's doctrine of Vishishtadvaita. Now, if you read the Nikhilanji's translation of this statement, Nikhilanji says the following. He translates this statement as, Shankara's non-dualistic explanation of Vedanta is true, and so is the qualified non-dualistic interpretation of Ramanuja. And I'm going to repeat the Bangla here because it's very significant. Sri Ramakrishna actually says, Vedanto Shankar ja bujiechen tao ache, abar Ramanujet Vishishtadvaita bado ache. The word ache in Bangla just means is there. There is X. So actually what he's saying is there is Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. There's also another school called Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita. There's no question of truth here. Nikhilanji says Shankara's Advaita is true and Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita is also true. True in Bengali is shotto, satya in Sanskrit. But you don't find that word in the statement. So I think that's a very, very misleading translation. That's why I've retranslated. There is the Vedanta as explained by Shankara. There's also Ramanuja's doctrine of Vishishtadvaita. Now, maybe you're thinking, well, this is a verbal quibble. Isn't that really the same thing? I think it's not, and let me explain why. I think it's important that Sri Ramakrishna is not saying that Shankara's Advaita Vedanta is true and Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita is also true. Why? Because the two philosophies, Shankara's philosophy and Ramanuja's philosophy, contradict each other at certain points. To give you one really key example, what is the nature of Brahman according to these two schools? According to Shankara, Brahman is ultimately only nirguna, which means without attributes, impersonal. And according to Ramanuja, Brahman is only saguna, personal, and not at all nirguna. You see, so there's a direct conflict between these two philosophies. So Sri Ramakrishna actually said that Shankara's Advaita Vedanta is true and Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita is true. Then he would have to accept Shankara's claim that Brahman is only nirguna, only impersonal and without attributes, and he would have to accept as true Ramanuja's doctrine, which is that Brahman is only saguna and not nirguna. And Sri Ramakrishna himself would fall into a contradiction. So that's why I think it's very important how we translate this statement. Sri Ramakrishna does not say that Shankara's philosophy and Ramanuja's philosophy are true in all of their doctrines. But what he does is something really brilliant. I think it's quite ingenious. He harmonizes these two philosophies in a different way by claiming that Shankara's Advaita Vedanta corresponds to a particular stage of spiritual experience, and Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita Vedanta corresponds to the subsequent stage of spiritual experience. Okay? So let me explain that in some detail. So another way of putting this would be that Sri Ramakrishna, even though he doesn't accept all of the doctrines of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta and of Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita, which would land him in contradiction, he accepts the spiritual core of both philosophies. So what's the spiritual core of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta according to Sri Ramakrishna? Shankara's philosophy corresponds to a spiritual experience which Sri Ramakrishna calls jnana. And this is from a passage I haven't read, but many of you are familiar with this. Sri Ramakrishna says, the Advaitic Jnana Yogi, the person pursuing the path of knowledge according to Shankara, begins by practicing a neti sadhana, saying not this, Brahman is not this world, Brahman is not the jivas, etc., etc. And he says it's like climbing up a staircase, leaving the steps behind one by one, until you reach the roof. The roof signifying knowledge of Brahman. Jnana, Brahma Jnana. So the person, finally, after he reaches the roof, it means he attains the knowledge of Brahman. This is what Sri Ramakrishna calls Jnana. Okay, why? Because in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, one feels, really, as a spiritual experience, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. The only reality is non-dual pure consciousness. I am that reality. There's no question of perceiving any world because you're in this trance state, Nirvikalpa Samadhi. And the world, even when you come down from the state of Samadhi, you still feel somehow that this world is a dream. It's insubstantial, it's a dream. But Sri Ramakrishna says, still using the same metaphor of the staircase and the roof, he says that there are some people, Ishvara Kotis, a special class of soul who are divinely commissioned, who after reaching the roof, recognize that the stairs are made of the same materials as the roof, brick, slime, and brick dust. That is the Vijnani, who recognizes that Brahman has become everything in this world. So therefore, this world is not unreal, but is actually a real manifestation of God. So if the Jnana realization gives us a philosophy of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, the world is unreal. The Vijnani's realization would be something like Brahma Shakti Satyam, Jagat Satyam. Brahma Shakti Satyam, we're going to find out why in a second. Because Brahman is the impersonal aspect of the divine reality, Shakti is the personal aspect of the same divine reality. So Brahma Shakti Satyam, Jagat Satyam, the world is a real manifestation of Shakti. Okay? And then you might ask, well, wait a minute, but what does Sri Ramakrishna? Maybe Sri Ramakrishna was a Jnani and not a Vijnani. But no, we just read this at the very end. Remember of this long passage. He looks directly at M, and Sri Ramakrishna says, I do see God directly. What shall I reason about? I clearly see that she herself has become everything, that she herself has become the universe and all living beings. This is clearly the standpoint of the Vijnani. And he says it even more explicitly in another place in the Gospel, where he says that I am not a Jnani. The Divine Mother has kept me in the state of a Vijnani. He uses the word Vijnani there. So it's uncontroversial that Sri Ramakrishna aligned himself with Vijnana rather than just Jnana. He of course had Brahma Jnana when he did Advaitic sadhana under Totapuri, his Advaitic guru. But he went beyond it. And he attained the further state of Vijnana, and he saw this entire world as a manifestation, a real manifestation of Shakti. But in any case, coming back to this passage where Narendra, Swami, the future Swami Vivekananda, directly asked Sri Ramakrishna, what is Vishtadvaita? And what you find is that Sri Ramakrishna explains Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita and then immediately sort of agrees with what Ramanuja is saying about this world as a real manifestation of God, and saying, I also see that. I see what Ramanuja says in his philosophy. I see that Divine Mother has become everything in this world. So it's hard to blame M for thinking that Sri Ramakrishna was a follower of Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita. Okay? Because he seems to be saying so in a certain sense. I mean, one can easily interpret it in that way. Again and again, Sri Ramakrishna is explaining his own standpoint by bringing in Ramanuja's philosophy. So then why can't we infer that Sri Ramakrishna was a follower of Ramanuja? This seems to be M's reasoning. But I think that what Sri Ramakrishna is doing when he compares his own philosophy with the philosophy of Ramanuja is he's pointing out similarities between Ramanuja's philosophy and his own philosophy, but he never claims anywhere that he was a follower of Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita. And I think there's an important difference there. You might think it's a subtle difference, but it's a very, very important difference. This is something I've already mentioned, but I'm going to repeat it again because I think it's very important. I think the main thing that M overlooks is the crucial fact that Sri Ramakrishna does not fully subscribe either to Shankara's Advaita Vedanta or to Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita Vedanta if only for this reason, that both of them are exclusivistic in a certain sense. What do I mean by exclusivistic? Shankara says that Brahman is only Nirguna. In that sense, it's exclusively Nirguna, not Saguna. He doesn't accept the personal God. Those of you out there who are wondering, well, wait a minute, he wrote these beautiful bhakti hymns, and he seems to be full of bhakti in these hymns. First of all, they may not be his. Most scholars think that they're not. And secondly, in the commentaries, the first source, the most authentic source of Shankara's teachings are his commentaries on the Prasthanatraya, on the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra. And I'll give the exact reference. In his commentary on Brahma Sutra 2.1.14, he explicitly says that the personal God itself is not existent from the ultimate standpoint, that the only reality is non-dual pure consciousness. So, Shankara is exclusivistic in insisting that Brahman is only impersonal, without attributes. Ramanuja is equally exclusivistic in the other direction, by claiming that Brahman is only saguna, personal. And he does not accept the reality of Nirguna Brahman. Okay? So ironically, I don't know if it's ironic, but it's interesting at least, if we imagine a conversation between Sri Ramakrishna and Ramanuja, and Sri Ramakrishna would be explaining this state of vijnana that comes after attaining the knowledge of non-dual, impersonal Brahman. Ramanuja will say, I don't even accept the state of vijnana. Why? Because I don't accept Nirguna Brahman. If you don't accept Nirguna Brahman, you cannot accept the state of Brahma Jnana in Shankara's sense. And if you can't accept Brahma Jnana, you cannot accept vijnana, because a precondition for attaining vijnana is the prior attainment of jnana, of Brahma Jnana, the knowledge of the impersonal, non-dual pure consciousness. Right? So Ramanuja would not have even accepted Sri Ramakrishna's teachings about vijnana, as far as I can tell. But as I said, even though Sri Ramakrishna does not subscribe fully either to Shankara's Advaita Vedanta or to Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita Vedanta, he beautifully harmonizes their philosophies at the level of spiritual experience by claiming that Shankara's Advaita Vedanta corresponds to the stage of Brahma Jnana, reaching the roof, knowledge of non-dual pure consciousness. He likens it to a saltall going to measure the depth of the ocean. But the moment the saltall sets foot in the ocean, it melts into the ocean. That's the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, knowledge of non-dual Brahman. And then he goes on to say that Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita philosophy corresponds to the Vijnana stage, which comes after the stage of Brahma Jnana. After reaching the roof, the Vijnani can go up and down the stairs freely. Why? Because the Vijnani knows that the steps are made of the same material as the roof, which means that this world, he's not afraid of the world, he or she. Because the world also is God. There's nothing that's not God. Okay, so now, I've been saying that I agree with Swami Turiyanandaji's understanding of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy. And the thing that Swami Turiyanandaji emphasizes again and again is that you cannot pigeonhole Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy into any of the traditional philosophical sects, whether it's Shankara's Advaita or Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita or Madhva's Vedanta or Tantra or Shaktadvaita. So in my previous book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, I call Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy Vijnana Vedanta because I think that his philosophy is based on this very important spiritual experience of Vijnana. And I explain that there are four, well, at least for the purposes of today's class, I want to mention four main tenets of Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta philosophy. And then I'll come back to the original question, was Sri Ramakrishna Vishtadvaitan? So the first key tenet of Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy, as I understand it, and as I think Swami Turiyanandaji understands it, is the infinite divine reality is both personal and impersonal, so both saguna and nirguna, and both with and without form, both sakara and nirakara. He says this in many places, but one of his most familiar teachings is Brahma Oshukti Abhed. Nirguna Brahman, so non-dual pure consciousness, and Shakti, by which he means the personal God, are abheda. They are inseparable. Inseparable but equally real aspects of the same divine reality. He uses the analogy of fire and fire's power to burn. He says that just as you cannot think of fire without thinking of fire's power to burn, you also cannot think of fire's power to burn without fire, without thinking of fire. So the two concepts are mutually dependent on each other, or mutually implicating. And in the same way, he says that Brahman and Shakti are inextricably linked to each other, inseparable aspects of the same reality. He says this in another way when he says, when I think of God as inactive, nishkriya, as static, then I call it Brahman. When I think of that same God as creating, preserving, and destroying this universe, then I call it Shakti, or Kali. Okay? So that's the first tenet. Second tenet, what about this world? He says that this world is a real manifestation of God. This should be very clear from the handout already. He says that the Vijnani sees that Brahman has become the 24 cosmic principles. And in another passage, which I discussed in detail in a previous class here, M asks Sri Ramakrishna, is the world unreal? And then Sri Ramakrishna says in response, why should the universe be unreal? That is how Advaitic Jnana Yogis reason. After realizing God, one sees that it is God himself who has become the universe and all living beings. So very emphatically, Sri Ramakrishna is saying that I do not accept Shankara's view of Jagat Mithya, that this world is unreal. I accept the view that this world is a real manifestation of Shakti, that there's nothing but God in this world. Okay, so now at this point, I imagine that some people may object, but wait a minute, the gospel also, there are places in the gospel where Sri Ramakrishna says, he seems to teach along the lines of Shankara, saying that Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, that this world is unreal. And they might quote certain places where Sri Ramakrishna says that. That's true. There are many places in the gospel where he talks about Advaita Vedanta. But the thing to keep in mind is, what's very, very important, and what's so nice about the gospel, is that it's not just a record of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, it's a day-to-day diary. And you see to whom Sri Ramakrishna is speaking, and you see the entire context, the conversational, the dialogic context of his teachings. And what you'll find, and I make this argument in detail in the first chapter of my book, Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, what you'll find is that whenever Sri Ramakrishna is talking about the Advaitic position, that Brahman alone is real and that this world is ultimately unreal, he immediately goes on to contrast that view with his own view. He says, but I believe, and then he goes on to explain a different view. Let me give you one example. 26th October, 1884. Sri Ramakrishna is speaking to Mohimacharan, who is a staunch Shankarite himself. So Sri Ramakrishna knew that he likes Shankara's philosophies. That's why he's telling him. He says, Sri Ramakrishna says to Mohima, in the light of Advaita Vedantic reasoning, the world is illusory, unreal as a dream. Now what happens is people might take this statement out of context and say, see, Sri Ramakrishna believed the world is illusory, unreal as a dream. But hold on, let's keep going. The Supreme Soul, Sri Ramakrishna continues, is the witness of the three states of waking, dream, and deep sleep. But for my part, I accept everything. But for my part, I accept everything. Turiya, meaning that fourth state, the state beyond all the three states of waking, dream, and deep sleep. But for my part, I accept everything. Turiya and also the three states of waking, dream, and deep sleep. I accept all three states. I accept all, Brahman and also Maya, the universe and its living beings. If I accepted less, I should not get the full weight. And then a devotee asks, the full weight, how is that? And then it's written there, all laugh. Then Sri Ramakrishna says, Brahman is qualified by the universe and its living beings. Vishishtadvaita again. At the beginning, while following the method of not this, one has to eliminate the universe and its living beings. But as long as I consciousness remains, one cannot but feel that it is God himself who has become everything. He alone has become the 24 cosmic principles. Then Mohimacharan says a little bit later, it is a good synthesis from the Nitya to the Leela and from the Leela to the Nitya. Then Sri Ramakrishna says, the Jnanis regard everything as illusory, like a dream. The Jnanis, he's not saying I do, Jnanis. The Jnanis regard everything as illusory, like a dream. But the Bhaktas accept all the states. The milk flows only in driblets from the Jnani. All laugh. There are some cows that pick and choose their fodder, hence their milk flows only in driblets. But cows that don't discriminate so much and eat whatever they get give milk in torrents. A superior devotee of God accepts both the nitya and the lila. Therefore, he is able to enjoy the divine even when his mind comes down from the absolute. Such a devotee is like the cows that give milk in torrents. He's clearly describing himself, the Vijnani, who is not afraid of this world, who doesn't dismiss this world as unreal. He embraces the world. What is he afraid of? He accepts everything. And so the analogy here is a cow who eats everything. Because he eats everything, the milk is full of nutrition, right? And he gives copiously, right? Okay, so second tenet, the world is a real manifestation of Shakti. Third of the 4 key tenets I want to discuss has to do with spiritual practices, the scheme of spiritual practices. We all know about the 4 yogas, I assume, karma yoga, bhakti yoga, jnana yoga, raja yoga, right? What were Shankara's and Ramanuja's views on spiritual practice, and what were Sri Ramakrishna's views in relation to theirs? According to Shankara, jnana yoga, the path of knowledge, is the highest spiritual practice. Jnana yoga alone leads to the highest knowledge of Brahman, and therefore to liberation. And he says that bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion, and karma yoga, the yoga of selfless works, those are good, but those are lower practices for inferior spiritual aspirants, which are good for purifying the mind and concentrating the mind, but ultimately you have to stop those practices. Once you get a sufficiently pure mind, then you practice jnana yoga, and only then can you attain liberation. Then a few centuries later, Ramanuja comes along, a great bhakti philosopher within the Vedantic tradition. And he turns the tables on Shankara, and he says that, no, you're completely wrong. The highest spiritual practice is bhakti yoga, the yoga of devotion toward a personal God. And your jnana yoga, actually it's not your jnana yoga, this is important also. What Ramanuja means by jnana yoga is not quite the same thing as what Shankara means. So jnana yoga does not always mean the same thing across the different traditions. But in any case, Ramanuja says that karma yoga and jnana yoga are helpful preliminary disciplines, which make you eligible ultimately to practice bhakti yoga, which is the highest path, which alone leads to the highest goal of life, which is knowledge of the personal God, Vishnu Narayana, according to Ramanuja. And that is liberation. So what was Sri Ramakrishna's view? Sri Ramakrishna says, enough with all this higher and lower. All paths are equally capable of taking us to the goal of God realization. And it's not a matter of higher and lower, it's a matter of temperament and preference. You have to understand yourself. Some people have a devotional temperament, others have a more intellectual temperament, others have a very dynamic temperament and personality. For them it might be karma yoga. For intellectuals it might be jnana yoga. For bhaktas it might be bhakti yoga, and so on. Some people love meditation, raja yoga. But Sri Ramakrishna goes, something that's really remarkable is you rarely find this even in India. There's so many saints, it's a country of saints, but he goes beyond Hinduism and he practices non-Hindu religions, and he comes to the conclusion through his own spiritual realizations, through his own practice of Christianity and Islam, that even other world religions are also equally valid paths leading to the same goal of God realization. So this is one statement taken from the gospel. He says, with sincerity and earnestness, one can realize God through all religions. The Vaishnavas will realize God, and so will the Shaktas, the Advaita Vedantins, and the Brahmos. By Brahmo, he means the followers of the Brahma Samaj, which was very popular in the 19th century. And then he says, the Muslims and Christians will realize God too. All will certainly realize God if they are earnest and sincere. Third tenet. And one of my favorite formulations of his teaching of the harmony of all religious paths is Tini Ananto Patho Ananto in Bangla, which means God is infinite and the paths to God are infinite. So the beauty of this teaching is that he explains why there are infinite paths to God. There are infinite paths to God because God himself is infinite, or God herself is infinite. That's the beauty. Fourth tenet. Sri Ramakrishna, let me segue into the fourth tenet by asking another question. What is the soul's relationship to God? This is another huge point of controversy among the different schools of Vedanta. What does Shankara say? Shankara says that ultimately the individual soul is identical with the highest reality, Brahman, which is non-dual pure consciousness. Absolute identity. This is Shankara's view. Ramanuja's view is that individual souls are amshas of God, of Vishnu. Amsha in the sense of portion. Madhva says individual souls are servants of God. Okay? What is Sri Ramakrishna's position? Again, he harmonizes all of these different views. There's a very important passage in the Gospel where he says to his own intimate disciples, this is when there aren't just random people coming and visiting him, they're all gone, and he looks around and he says, "You are my very own. I tell you that I've come to the final realization that God is the whole and I am a part of him, that God is the master and I am his servant. Furthermore, I think every now and then that he is I and I am he. Tomra apnar lok, tomader bolchi, shesh ei bujechi, tini purno ami tar ongsho, tini prabhu ami tar das, abar ek ek par bhabi, tini ami, ami tini." He's not just, so one thing is, in many places in the Gospel, he quotes a familiar verse in Sanskrit. It's attributed to Hanuman addressing Rama. Hanuman says to Rama, "When I identify with the body, I say, I am your servant. When I identify with the Jivatman, I say, I am a part of you. And when I identify with the Supreme Atman, I say, I am you. Deha buddhya dasosmi, jiva buddhya todam shakaha, atma buddhya tumevaham, iti me nishchitamatihi." But the important thing here is Sri Ramakrishna is not just quoting some kind of old verse. He's saying, I'm telling you, people in particular, my antaranga, those who are closest to me, about my highest realization, my final realization, shesh e bujati. This is what I've realized after all of my spiritual practices and spiritual realizations. And then he says basically something very similar, that all three of these different relationships between the soul and God, these three different ways that the soul can relate to and commune with God are equally true at different levels of consciousness. Another way that he puts it beautifully in other places in the Gospel is that he uses the analogy of a flute, a seven-holed flute. And he says, why should I just put my finger on one of the holes and go, or I don't know how the flute sounds in it. But in any case, he's saying, why should I just say, I am Brahman, I am Brahman, I am he, the Advaitic view. I want to play ragas and raginis. Those are Indian classical musical terms for whole tunes, beautiful tunes. I want to play tunes on this by using all seven holes. I want to relate to God and commune with God in many different ways, as his servant, as her servant, as her child. Sometimes feeling that I'm one with her. Sometimes feeling that I'm her lover. That's the Madhura Bhava. So many, all these different kinds. So again, he's able to harmonize all of these different schools of Vedanta, Shankara, Ramanuja, Madhva, and other traditions on the basis of his expansive spiritual state of Vijnana. Because in that spiritual state of Vijnana, he has the simultaneous realization of God both as impersonal and as personal. And he is able to commune with God at different levels of consciousness. So now, coming back to the original question, the title of today's class, was Sri Ramakrishna a Vishishtadvaitan? The answer, as I said earlier, is that no, I don't think he was a Vishishtadvaitan, because I think Sri Ramakrishna taught a harmonizing philosophy that cannot be pigeonholed into any of the traditional Vedantic schools. And I want to point out 4 important differences between Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta philosophy and Ramanuja's Vishishtadvaita philosophy, just to clarify exactly in what sense I think that he's not a Vishishtadvaitan. First, as I mentioned repeatedly, but I'll say it again, Ramanuja claims that Brahman is exclusively personal, only personal, saguna. Ramanuja does not accept Nirguna Brahman. By contrast, what was the first tenet of his Vijnana Vedanta? The infinite divine reality, according to Sri Ramakrishna, is both Nirguna Brahman and Saguna Brahman, both impersonal and personal. So first key difference between Ramanuja's philosophy and Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. Second important difference between Ramanuja and Sri Ramakrishna. Ramanuja accepts only one form of God as the highest, namely Vishnu Narayana. And Vishnu is always pictured in a very specific way by Ramanuja. This is a common depiction of Vishnu with a discus and a mace, and he's lying on what's called a shesha, which is a serpent bed. So very, very specific details. This is the one form of God which Ramanuja takes to be the highest. Okay? All others are either completely false or lower. What is Sri Ramakrishna's view on this issue? Sri Ramakrishna, by contrast, accepts all forms of the personal God as equal. He never says that one form of the personal God is somehow higher or more real or more comprehensive than others. He uses a beautiful analogy, the analogy of an ocean. So I'll just read this. This is also from the Gospel. He says, Satchit Ananda is like an infinite ocean. Intense cold freezes the water into ice, which floats on the ocean in blocks of various forms. Notice, various forms. Likewise, through the cooling influence of bhakti, one sees forms of God, Shakarmurti, in the ocean of the Absolute. These forms are meant for the bhaktas, the lovers of God. But when the sun of knowledge rises, Gyan Shurjo, the ice melts. It becomes the same water it was before. Water above and water below, everywhere nothing but water. But you may say that for certain devotees, God assumes eternal forms, Nitya Shakar. There are places in the ocean where the ice does not melt at all. It assumes the form of quartz, Sputikerakar. Okay, keep in mind, especially the last part of this passage. So the second key difference is Ramanuja accepts only one form of God as the highest, namely the form of Vishnu, with the discus and mace and all these things. Sri Ramakrishna says, I accept all the forms of the personal God. It can be Christ, it can be Krishna, it can be Vishnu, it can be anything, and I accept them all. There's no higher and lower. Third key difference, and I'll come back to the passage as I said. According to Ramanuja, because his understanding of Vishnu is very specific, his understanding of the highest state of salvation after we leave the physical body is also extremely specific. There are all sorts of very specific details he gives about Vaikuntha Loka. That's the name of this heaven in which Vishnu resides, and in which liberated souls reside with Vishnu, okay, in a loving relationship. But going back to this passage I just read to you, imagine that Sri Ramakrishna, in talking about this ocean analogy, imagine that if he said these forms, he talks about the forms of the bhaktas likened to icebergs or whatever, ice formations in the ocean. And then he went on to say, but when the sun of knowledge rises, the ice melts. It becomes the same water it was before. If his teaching stopped there, followers of Shankara would be very pleased. Because they say, see, with the rising of the sun of knowledge, those ice forms melt, meaning the forms of the personal God are ultimately sublated, they're ultimately negated by the higher knowledge of non-dual pure consciousness. But the story doesn't end there, and that's what I think is so significant. He then says, but you may say that for certain devotees, bhaktas, God assumes eternal forms, Nitya Shakara, Nitya Sakara. There are places in the ocean where the ice does not melt at all. He's directly contradicting Shankara's philosophy here. Okay, so now coming back to this third key difference, right? It's the nature of salvation, because Sri Ramakrishna says that, look, what you Advaita Vedantins take to be the highest state of salvation, the Advaitins don't believe in any kind of heaven, at least as a highest state. They say there's no coming and going for the liberated soul. You just rest in your true nature as pure consciousness, non-dual pure consciousness. That's salvation. Sri Ramakrishna says, that's it. That's great. You'll have that if that's what you want. And again, remember the saltal. So the saltal will merge in the ocean. That's the Advaitic ideal of salvation. Sri Ramakrishna says, great, that's good for you. But bhaktas don't want to become sugar, they want to eat sugar, he says again and again in the gospel. What does that mean? It means they want to maintain some separation between themselves and the personal God in order to love God and commune and relate to God in a loving relationship. So the other thing is, which is important, is Sri Ramakrishna accepts many different lokas, not just any one, you know. Some bhakti schools often are a little bit rigid about this. They accept only one form of heaven as the highest. But Sri Ramakrishna says it's not that. Since all of the different forms of the personal God are equally true, and there's no higher and lower, then the different forms of salvation can also be equally valuable. the Christian heaven, the Muslim heaven, the Vaishnava heaven, the heaven for Ramanuja, which is this Vaikuntha Loka, they're all on a par. And I like to think of Sri Ramakrishna's understanding of salvation as a many-roomed mansion where the liberated soul can choose which room the soul wants to inhabit. I want to merge in Brahman. So then you go there. That's your Advaitic salvation. But the Christian doesn't want that. The Christian wants to commune with Christ or God the Father. So then he'll go to the Christian heaven. And so on and so forth. These many-roomed mansion. That's the way I see it. And fourth and finally, the fourth key difference is that, remember, that Ramanuja places Bhakti Yoga on a higher footing than Jnana Yoga and Karma Yoga. Okay? But Sri Ramakrishna assiduously avoids any talk of higher and lower. And he says that all yogas are equally capable of taking us to the goal of God realization. And that it really comes down more to a matter of temperament and preference. Bhaktas like to eat sugar, Advaitins want to become sugar. So before I conclude, I wanted to mention one other thing. Maybe after hearing this, some people will say, okay, good, so you've made a great case that Sri Ramakrishna was not a Vishtadvait, and so therefore he must have been a follower of Shankara. But of course, anybody who has been carefully listening to my class will not draw that conclusion, because again and again, I've been emphasizing that you can also not pigeonhole Sri Ramakrishna into the Shankara school, or any traditional school for that matter. And I want to just emphasize here three key differences between Shankara's Advaita Vedanta and Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta. First, Shankara accepted the ultimate reality only of Nirguna Brahman, so the exact diametrical opposite of Ramanuja. Whereas, remember, Sri Ramakrishna taught Brahma Shakti Abhed. Brahman is, the ultimate reality is equally personal and impersonal. First key difference between Sri Ramakrishna and Shankara. Second key difference, Shankara claimed that this world does not exist from the ultimate standpoint, whereas Sri Ramakrishna claims that that corresponds to the stage of jnana, but there's a further realization called vijnana, and the vijnani sees that Brahman has become everything in this world, which means this world is a real manifestation of God. Third key difference, Shankara holds that Jnana Yoga is the highest path and the only direct path to liberation. Bhakti Yoga and Karma Yoga are lower disciplines. Sri Ramakrishna says that any of these yogas are equally capable of taking us to the highest goal of God realization. So, one of the key takeaways from this class, I hope, is the following, that it would be limiting Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna himself used to say, you can never put a limit to God. Bhagavan kono iti nahi. You can never say God is just this and not this. But I think the same thing can be said about Sri Ramakrishna himself. The moment you say he was just a Shankarite or just a Ramanujite, you're limiting him. And I think that's a fundamental mistake when we're trying to understand the broadness of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings in his life. In fact, in one place in the Gospel, Sri Ramakrishna says something very nice. He says, I've practiced all the disciplines. I accept all paths. I respect the Shaktas, the Vaishnavas, and also the Advaita Vedantins. Therefore, people of all sects come here, and every one of them thinks that I belong to his or her school. This last statement is really beautiful. And this is really true, because in the 150 years since he left his body, scholar after scholar has come along and claimed, some scholars claim that Sri Ramakrishna was a tantric. Walter Neville is one of these people. Narasingha Sil says, no, he was a Vaishnava. A lot of our monks, like Omkarananda and Dhireshananda, no, he was a Shankarite. He was an Advaita Vedantan. M says, no, he was a Vishtadvaitan. This has been going on. And I can just picture Sri Ramakrishna laughing, and of course he's still here, right? So I'm sure he's just smiling on all of us, because we're all still doing the same thing, the very thing that he was warning against. You cannot pin me down, he kept saying, right? That's why everybody thinks I belong to their sect, right? Precisely because my philosophy encompasses all of them. I harmonize, I accept all of them because my philosophy is broader than any of these traditional sects. So, let me summarize as follows. It seems to me, I want to explain exactly in what sense I see Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta philosophy as harmonizing some of the traditional philosophical schools. Let's start with Shankara's Advaita Vedanta. This corresponds to Nirguna Brahman, which Sri Ramakrishna fully accepts, right? Because for Shankara, the highest reality is Nirguna Brahman, the impersonal, non-dual pure consciousness. Sri Ramakrishna fully accepts it, and he claims that you can attain knowledge of non-dual Brahman in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. What about Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita? He also accepts Ramanuja's Vishtadvaita philosophy, And especially Ramanuja's teaching that this world is a real manifestation of God, that Brahman is qualified by this world and all living beings. Third, Madhva's Dvaita Vedanta, the school of dualism. Sri Ramakrishna, you'll find in many places, he fully embraces the attitude of the child and the servant of God, which is Madhva's attitude. And he also accepts Madhva's doctrine that there's an eternal heaven. When you attain liberation, you dwell with the personal God. He fully accepts that. And Sri Ramakrishna says again and again that eating sugar is as valuable as becoming sugar. There's no higher and lower there. What about Tantra and Kashmiri Shaivism? A number of Sri Ramakrishna's teachings agree with these schools. First, I think his teachings on the nature of ultimate reality as both impersonal and personal. Right? Both Brahman and Shakti. This is very similar to Kashmiri Shaivite teachings, Prakasha Vimarshamaya. It's both Shiva and Shakti. And another key teaching, this world is a real manifestation of God. It wasn't just Ramanuja who taught that. Tantra and Kashmiri Shaivism also teach the same doctrine, that this world is a manifestation of Shiva. It's not unreal. And they explicitly distinguish their doctrine from the doctrine of Shankara's Advaita Vedanta in this regard. And fifthly, what about Vaishnavism? Sri Ramakrishna, in the Gospel, you'll find many references to Vaishnavism. He had tremendous love for Krishna. He realized Krishna in many, many different forms. And he accepted, in many places, he says that he accepts all of the different Vaishnava bhavas, the different ways, the different attitudes one can have toward God. The ones I already mentioned, like being a servant of God and being a lover of God and many others. He also accepted Goloka, which is the highest heaven for Vaishnavas. In one place, when he's talking to Mohima Chakraborty, he says, some schools of bhakti accept the idea of Nitya Krishna, Nitya Bhakta, Chinmoy Sham, Chinmoy Dham. The idea of an eternal Krishna and his eternal devotees, bhaktas. The idea of an eternal abode, loka, which is Chinmoy, which means it's made of divine consciousness. Or that's Chinmoy Dham and Chinmoy Sham. And Krishna himself, in personal form, is also eternal. So you can find elements of all the different traditional schools in Sri Ramakrishna's teachings, but you cannot limit him to any one of them. That's the beauty and the greatness of Sri Ramakrishna. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu. Questions?
Thank you. Hello. Test, test, test.
Oh, it's not working. Okay, hold on.
Test, test, test. Here we go. I've got a couple questions. The first one is about the end of the third paragraph of the second passage, where he says the Nitya and the Lila are two aspects of one and the same reality. And you quoted another passage where he talks about the Nitya and the Lila. The Lila, I remember it's like the dance or the play of God. What's Nitya again?
It just means eternal, but it's the eternal state. And I think what he has in mind here is non-dual Brahman.
Thank you. And with the first one, I translate books as well, and in general, I'm very against translators editorializing, because it's not really what you're supposed to do. But in this situation, considering that this is really M's personal opinion, I can kind of see why you would do that. And I was wondering, what's your opinion? Do you think that Swami Nikhananda ji was right to not translate this part, or do you think he should have translated?
I personally think he should have translated it, and part of the reason is because one thing that M was really, really careful about when he composed the Kathamrita is in distinguishing Sri Ramakrishna's own words and teachings from his own ideas. He never muddied the waters. And that's why he labeled that whole section, which went untranslated by Nikhananda as Shibok Hridoy, which means in the heart of, these are my thoughts. He's saying, hello, this is just one humble devotee's thoughts on God. He's the author of the book. Right. So ultimately, I think that we should translate it the way that the author wrote it. That's my opinion. And there's no danger that we're going to mistake that position as Sri Ramakrishna's. See, we should grant everybody the capacity to think for themselves. That's what I think we should do. Instead of censoring and say, say, oh, we shouldn't say that, otherwise they might be misled. We're not stupid, So let us think for ourselves. That's my view.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, Nishant.
Maharaj, I love this idea that the avatara doesn't come to be redundant, and Sanskrit also, no redundancy. But there's also one view in which the avatara doesn't add anything new. Like in Matthew, it says, I come to uphold, not to break the law. There's nothing new under the sun. So the avatara's role is to reinvigorate. So you get that view in Matthew, right? So.
Well, okay, but hold on. But you just mixed up two things. One is Ecclesiastes. There's nothing new under the sun.
Yes,
but that's from the Hebrew Bible.
Yes.
And then Jesus' teaching is that I've come to fulfill rather than destroy.
Yes.
But even that fulfillment has a kind of uniqueness to it, right?
Definitely.
He didn't say I've come to repeat the same things, because he didn't, right? And look at the Sermon on the Mount. The Ten Commandments are found in the Hebrew Bible. Thou shalt not commit adultery. What does Jesus do? He radicalizes each one of the Ten Commandments by saying, even if you look upon a woman with lust in your heart, you have already committed adultery.
Exactly.
So that's new. I mean, that's what I'm saying. In that sense, Sri Ramakrishna also didn't throw away anything. But he fulfilled the existing traditions of Vedanta by broadening them and accepting the spiritual core of each of these philosophies.
Right, exactly. I think that's where I'm headed. It's like, that's what I want, and I want to hear your opinion on this. Insofar as in verse 19 of the Pratyabhigya Hridaya Sutra, we're getting this language like vyutane bhuyash, come out again and again slowly, and then maintain the sanskara of samadhi. And then you'll have this chid aikya marshan kind of thing, where with eyes open you see, and the language is chid ananda ganna, which sounds like rush. Right?
Yeah.
And you can see this is a samadhivan who's going into samadhi over and over and seeing that everywhere, right?
Yeah.
That's a lot like Drita Sahaja Samadhi Chinmayam, So then, my question is, insofar as Kashmiri Shaivism also privileges its philosophy as Param Advaya because of inclusiveness, so much so that they accept Charvakas as worshippers of Shakti without Shiva, is Sri Ramakrishna's fulfillment of Kashmiri Shaivism, insofar as it's an extension, just making it more inclusive than it is now? Or do you see any other differences?
I think that the language of inclusivism is kind of confusing now because scholars use these terms in different ways.
Yeah.
But the technical meaning of inclusivism is there's an assumption of one philosophy being the highest and other ones being not wrong but lower. And I think that's exactly where Sri Ramakrishna parts ways with Kashmiri Shaivism, right? Because he says that it's not that one philosophy is higher than the others. And it's not that there's this kind of elaborate hierarchy starting with Charvaka, going all the way up in like slowly increasingly spiritual philosophies culminating in my own. But it's a matter of temperament and whatever floats your boat kind of. I don't see that so much in Kashmiri Shaivism. There might be elements of it, but it's not as radical a pluralism as Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy.
That's the key difference, you would say.
I think that's one. Yeah, but I think there are others. I think if you really go into the weeds of the Kashmiri Shaivite text, they're so specific about a lot of different things, about sadhana. And, they have these even hierarchy of sadhana. The highest being that the anupaya, right? Where the no sadhana. Those people are so advanced that they don't need to practice sadhana in order to attain the highest.
Which Ramakrishna does say about certain
that's true. Yeah,
devotees,
okay.
right?
In some ways, right? But again, if you look at the details of this further steps, I think Sri Ramakrishna was much more cautious about being too rigid and narrow about like these are the stages, and these are the steps, and these are the only kinds of practice that he's much broader, I think, in those ways. That's my feeling.
So I'd say two things then. One is he's more inclusive. He's not hierarchical.
Yeah.
Secondly, he's not as technical and as rigid.
Yeah, we're going to have this discussion soon, I guess, next week. But there's another one where I do think that there's this issue of, especially in Kashmiri Shaivism, they kind of seem to me to try to steer a middle course between Shankara's Vivartavada, which is the doctrine that this world is an illusory appearance, and the view of Ramanuja, which is that Parinamavada, which is that Brahman actually, some aspect of Brahman actually transforms. Parinama means transformation, actually transforms in the world. And Kashmiri Shaivism says we believe in Abhasavada. And Abhasa means, actually even translating the term is complicated. Jaideva Singh, I think, translates it as manifestation, which is good. If you want to translate it as manifestation, then that comes pretty close to Sri Ramakrishna, but there are other interpreters of Kashmiri Shaivism who interpret Abhasa in more of an illusionistic way.
Vimarsha.
Not fully illusionistic, but kind of moving in the direction of Shankara. And again, though, if the closer they come to Shankara, the further away they move from Sri Ramakrishna, in my opinion.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
There's a question in the back. Oh, and then here, yeah.
Thank you, Swami, for beautiful exposition. It's true. Well, it's true that Ramakrishna never, said that this path is higher and lower, but didn't he say that in modern age or Kali Yuga, Bhakti Yoga is probably easiest for most people.
Yeah.
It's easier to connect, to build that relationship. Just like he also speaks about music, because music, of all the discipline of life, music is one that quickly you can just
touch the heart.
Yeah,
that's right. No, absolutely, yeah. So again, I think that's absolutely right. He never says that bhakti is higher than the other paths, but he does say that bhakti is easier for most people. Why? Because in this Kali Yuga, this age of extreme materialism, most people are extremely body conscious. And so long as there's body consciousness, bhakti is the safest and easiest path. Bhagavan Krishna in Bhagavad Gita says the same thing in chapter 12. Kleshodikatarastesham avyakta sakta chetasam. Avyakta ikatita. So the path of jnana is extremely difficult for those who have body consciousness. Dehavad bhiravapyate. Thank you.
Hi, Swamiji. So I actually had a question about Vijnana because it seems like one of the ways that Sri Ramakrishna describes the process of becoming a Vijnani as first you ascend to the highest step of the staircase, right?
Or the roof.
Yeah. The roof, sorry, yeah. And that corresponds to attaining jnana, right? And then once you do that, though, you see that all of the steps that you left behind in the process, they're constituted of the same materials. Like you realize that God pervades the world and, the jiva and everything. Now, I guess my question is, why couldn't like a different ordering of things also be possible? Like what if you kind of start off by realizing that all of the materials are kind of the same thing, like developing a realization of Saguna Brahman at first, and then developing a realization of Nirguna Brahman, like attaining the highest step. So that way you experience both of the states.
Yeah, but he also accepts that actually. In a number of places he says that even bhaktas can attain the knowledge of Brahman because God is capable of anything. And so by God's grace, even the devotee who's worshiping the personal God through different bhakti practices, prayer and worship and all those things, can also attain the knowledge of Brahman. So he does accept that as well.
So those would also be counted as Vijnanis, correct?
Wait, what? Oh, those people? No. Actually, in fact, Swami Bhajananandaji, another senior monk in our order, he's also in Bilimut, he's a trustee. He has a diagram, a parabola. And he says on the left trough of the parabola, that corresponds to the bhaktas who have realized some form of the personal God. The peak of the parabola, that corresponds to Advaitic Nirvikalpa Samadhi, reaching the roof. The right-hand trough of the parabola corresponds to the Vijnana, to the Vijnani's realization. Because one is post-Brahmajnana, the other is pre-Brahmajnana. That's the key difference, do you see? But that makes all the difference. Between the ordinary bhakta, I don't want to say ordinary bhakta, they've realized God in some form of the personal God. But still, ordinary compared to the Vijnani who has climbed to the roof, attained the knowledge of non-dual pure consciousness, and then also realized that Brahman is also personal.
I see.
Yeah,
I see.
Parabola. Yeah, so a little math lesson.
Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks.
We have some online questions.
Sure, go for it.
And also we have some questions regarding the previous lecture on...
Oh boy, on Mary Hill.
They're back.
First ask the other ones, and then if we have time, we'll resurrect the ghost of Mary Hill.
Keep it a little bit away.
Swamiji, in the lecture you delivered in Mysore, you had quoted...
Now we're going back to Mysore. Okay, all right, anyway, but go ahead.
You had quoted Swami Vivekananda saying, "The more I meditate on Advaita, the more I disagree with Shankara and come to accept Ramanuja's commentary." That's
I made a big whopper of a mistake in my Mysore lecture. The mistake I made is, and I'm not going to throw anybody under the bus here, but there was a brother monk of mine who was reading New Discoveries by Marie-Louise Burke. and became very excited when he saw this passage, the one that was just read. And he sent it to me by WhatsApp and said, Swamiji himself said this. So I was like, what? Really? I thought it was strange, but I say I'm a scholar, but then I didn't look it up. I should have looked it up. So it was a blunder on my part. I didn't look it up. And I said that in this Mysore lecture. Afterward, I looked it up, and it turns out it was Swami Kripananda, who was one of Swamiji's American disciples, who said that, not Swami Vivekananda. And so that was a terrible mistake, so that I apologize for that.
Feels like Sri Aurobindo's philosophy of a divine manifestation of life is inspired directly from Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta. Same force working through them.
So who is the person being talked about in the beginning?
Aurobindo.
Aurobindo. Oh. Yeah, I mean, the thing is, I don't know, whether the questioner has studied much of Sri Aurobindo's life and teachings, but he was directly influenced by Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, so that's not a coincidence, and he came after, of course, but he kept the dust of Dakshineshwar in his room in Pondicherry. He had 3 mystical visions of Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna came to him, and they both spoke Bangla with each other. So, and of course, mystically. And so Sri Ramakrishna said, Aurobindo, mundir koro. Aurobindo, start your own ashrama, and many other things. And then Swami Vivekananda came and visited Sri Aurobindo in the Alipur jail in Kolkata. He was in jail for his political activities. He was a freedom fighter. And Swami Vivekananda taught him meditation techniques and higher realizations. So that's not at all a coincidence. He was directly influenced by Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda.
How should we view Swami Vivekananda establishing Advaita Ashram, where exclusively classical Advaita is taught from a Vijnana perspective?
Right, yeah. So the way I understand it is, so what they're referring to is, for instance, we have an Advaita Ashrama in the Himalayas in Mayavati, where it's discouraged, if not prohibited, to do ritualistic worship of even Sri Ramakrishna himself or of any form of the personal God. So it's strictly Advaitic. And yeah, I mean, the way to explain that from the Vijnana standpoint is exactly what Bhuteshanandaji, he said this, because there's a monk who asked him about this incident. And then he said, yeah, but there are hundreds of ashramas, and that's one of them. And the beauty of Sri Ramakrishna is that he was Ananta Bhavmoy, which means that he was a spiritual being of infinite spiritual moods, of infinite spiritual attitudes. And so the Mayavati ashrama corresponds to the Advaitic attitude, but you can't limit either Swami Vivekananda or Sri Ramakrishna to just that standpoint. And it's telling that out of the hundreds of ashramas we have in India, only 2 of them forbid ritualistic worship and prayer and all those things. The other ones, every other one, they don't talk about the other ones. There's, the one where I joined at Vivekananda, there's so many, where there's daily puja and there's aratis and this and that. They're all the whole kit and caboodle of bhakti, of worship, right? So yes.
Is there anything from Ma Sarada's life and sayings that sheds light on Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta?
That's a great question. I plan in the future to give a lecture on Holy Mother's philosophy, and I don't want to say anything superficial or premature, but just a few teachings come to mind. So first of all, apart from teachings, I mean, her life really embodies the really perfect synthesis of the 4 yogas in a really remarkable way, which is the real fruit of Vijnana, it seems to me. It's the Vijnani who, after realizing both the Nirguna Brahman and Nirvikalpa Samadhi and the various forms of the personal God, can be at home in everything, in everywhere, with everyone. Whether it's a Westerner like Nivedita, or even some, even Muslims, or even that thief, the robber, a very dangerous person, but she melted his heart by just treating him like her own child, So why? Because why was she able to have that universal love for everybody and be constantly engaged in service? Working all the time, and at the same time, she says she did 100,000 repetitions of the mantra every single day. Act lokko jap. It's a huge number. If you try to do it, you'll probably go crazy, or you won't sleep for 2. So she's doing. So that means constant japa going on, ajapa japa, which means kind of spontaneously doing mental japa without even trying. That's bhakti. Of course, there's constant prayer, which is also bhakti. But there's also that jnana. In a number of places, she goes into these high flights of jnana. And she says that, when you attain the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi, Ishwar Tishwar Thakur Fukur Shab Ure Jai, or something like that, where she says that even the forms of the personal God vanish. Just as Sri Ramakrishna had to cut the form of Kali in half when he was doing that Advaitic sadhana on the Totapuri in order to attain Nirvikalpa Samadhi. So she had jnana as well. Karma Yoga, she embodied it even more than either Swamiji or Sri Ramakrishna. And Raja Yoga, because the moment she would sit for meditation, she would go into a very deep state of concentration and trance. So at the level of her life, I think that she embodies the perfect synthesis of the 4 yogas, which is the inevitable outcome of the Vijnana Vedanta philosophy at the level of spiritual practice. And in terms of teachings, there are a few things. Like, for instance, she says in one place to a devotee, a householder devotee, the devotee asks her, he says, what will happen to us? We're just these ordinary householders. We don't have the spirit of dispassion. Then she says, Sri Ramakrishna has created Ramakrishna Loka for you, specifically for you. Ramakrishna Loka, this idea of Ramakrishna Loka is interesting. Sri Ramakrishna himself, as far as I'm aware, never talked about Ramakrishna Loka. But Holy Mother talks about it, and she says Sri Ramakrishna has created that Loka for his own bhaktas. And it's a Nitya Loka. So again, we come back to this idea that Sri Ramakrishna used to teach that all of these heavens, these eternal heavens, they are there for an eternity, not that they're temporary dwelling places and eventually you have to merge in Brahman. That would be more of a Shankarite position. But Holy Mother clearly says that there's also a Ramakrishna Loka, which bhaktas can attain if they want to. And that's as valuable as Advaitic Nirvikalpa Samadhi. But there's a lot more to say, but let's hold off until I actually give that lecture on Holy Mother Sharada Devi as a philosopher. That's my hope in the future. I'd like to give that lecture.
How will you define Brahman? Is it a fundamental reality or just an abstraction?
It's a fundamental reality. Ultimate reality is the way that any Vedantin should understand Brahman, I think. Now, exactly how they understand the Swarupa of Brahman, that'll differ from school to school, but everybody agrees that Brahman is the ultimate reality.
Infinite path to infinite reality. Should we not associate this with Patanjali Sutras? Because in Samadhi Pada, he offers so many options and concludes, meditate on anything that is good.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, there are some broad aspects to his teachings, but notice that it's meditate on, right? So still, meditation is the focus of the entire Yoga Sutra. And there's a very, very strong emphasis on the need to meditate in a specific way in order to eliminate all chitta vrittis, all the different mental modifications. So that's a very, very specific path, and then he has a very specific scheme of spiritual practices called Ashtanga Yoga, the eightfold yoga. Yama, Niyama, Asana, Pratyahara, so going in sequence. So that's very, very specific, and I don't see in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra anywhere the very broad teachings of Sri Ramakrishna along the lines of saying that because God is infinite, the paths to God are infinite. In fact, God has a very minimal role. It does play a role, but a minimal role in Patanjali's Yoga Sutra. And the concept of Ishvara is also not quite the same as Sri Ramakrishna's God, Ishwar. Sri Ramakrishna uses the same word, Ishvara, but it means something very different by it. Because in Patanjali, the Ishvara does not create this world, doesn't preserve it, it doesn't look over us, doesn't seem to respond to our prayers. And so it's very different from, so there are a lot of differences, I think, between Patanjali's system and Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy.
It might be that particle ma, like or.
Mm.
Right, that's I think Patanjali has that, and then Shiva Bodhodaya, Vijnana Bhairava, like this or, va, 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 va. Like,
yeah, no. Of course, there's also a broadness, as I said. So, feel free to meditate on whatever, helps you concentrate your mind. That's a great thing. So there's broadness, but I just think the Sri Ramakrishna is even broader.
The attitude or knack of Advaita to consider something lower or something higher, is it subtle lingering, ego of learning, or eligibility expressing itself?
That's interesting. I mean, maybe, but it could also be that, in one place in the Gospel, Sri Ramakrishna said something along the lines of, even realized souls can be one-sided because they realize God in a particular form or aspect, and then they end up generalizing based on their particular realization, and then because they arrived at their realization through a particular path, they end up privileging that path over other paths. So it took someone like Sri Ramakrishna, who practiced many different paths and realized God in many different forms and aspects to come along and kind of adjudicate these debates and say, you're all right, but you're all wrong. You're all wrong in limiting God to what you have realized of God. You're all wrong in saying that only your path will lead to God realization. But you're all right in actually appreciating and realizing even a certain true form of God. And you're right that along your particular path you can realize God. But don't say that yours is the only path and that your understanding of God exhausts the nature of God.
Is there a Vijnani in the Ramakrishna order of monks now? Has this Swami met any Vijnani in his life? Does he aspire to become a Vijnani? What does he need to do to become a Vijnani?
A lot of questions. Yeah, Shivananda. Yeah, no. I mean, one can of course aspire and maybe should aspire to be a Vijnani, but not everybody who aspires attains. And do I know anybody? It's hard to say. In our order, we're encouraged to be reticent about our spiritual experiences. And so even if somebody has attained very high spiritual attainments, they're very likely not going to talk about them, except maybe in private. So my answer is, I don't know. I may have met a Vijnani without knowing it.
When Thakur says that Chit Shakti has become all this, does it hint at Parinamvad?
Parinamavad.
Or is it like Urna Navi in Mundaka Upanishad?
Yeah. Oh, that's interesting. Okay. So is it Parinamavada when Sri Ramakrishna says that the Divine Mother has become everything? Or is it this Yatorna Nabi Sajate? So this is a mantra from the Mundaka Upanishad. It's a beautiful metaphor of a spider which spins out a web from out of itself. But the thing is, the question I would say is ill-framed because this spider analogy lends itself to a Parinamavada interpretation. Because there are two kinds of causality. One is instrumental cause and the other is material cause. And the spider analogy reflects the Brahman as the material cause of this world. Brahman actually becomes this world. That's the whole point of this spider analogy, the Urnanabi. Yeah, exactly. So Maharaj is saying that there's another Upanishad which says that having created this world, God then enters into this creation. So God is fully immanent in this world. And so the spider metaphor actually, I think, supports Parinamavada. And then coming back to the question of, well, then does Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy also count as Parinamavada? This is a good question. And I mean, I think it comes much closer to Parinamavada than to Vivartavada because in Bangla, the word that's used is hoyechen. Bigyani dekhe brahmo chotur bingshi tattva hoyechen. Hoyechen. Hoyechen really means has become. Has become. Now, if that's not Parinamavada, maybe it's something else, but at least it comes closer to Parinamavada than to Vivartavada, which is that this world is just an illusory appearance of Brahman. It's not an illusory appearance. Brahman actually has become everything. To the point where when he's doing puja, he sees the cat as Brahman, he sees the koshakushi, the different puja vessels as Brahman, he sees the door sill as Brahman, literally.
If Vijnana Vedanta has to be established as an official Vedanta school, isn't it necessary to have commentaries on the Prasthanatraya in the light of Thakur's teachings?
Yes, if God willing, I'll do my best to get on that. But I don't know if I'll finish the task. I mean, it would be 3 separate books, one on Gita, one on Upanishads, one on Brahma Sutra. We'll see how far I get. Yes. But go ahead.
No, that's it. We have only Mary Hill with a question.
Mary, well, let's ask about the question. No?
No, I do.
Please, go ahead. No, yeah, no. Yeah.
If I must. I feel that a lot of what you discussed with him, Sri Ramakrishna, melding all these different aspects is really encapsulated with his repeating throughout the gospel where he says one cannot attain Brahman as long as the I exists, as long as there is as long as there's this again and again. But as you speak of the melding, there's another level to that where he has also attained that I. So he has both.
He has both, yeah. I mean, the way he puts it is that after attaining the state of Brahma Jnana, the Vijnani then, when he comes back to this world, God leaves in the Vijnani one of two forms of I, either the sense of the devotee, bhaktirami, or the feeling of the, Sri Ramakrishna, the Bangla is biddarami, which means not ego is not the right word. I think Niklanji here says ego, but teacher of knowledge or, the I of knowledge. I is more neutral. Ego always has these negative connotations, but it's not ego, because he's completely crushed his ahankara. There's no ahankara anymore. But how do you identify yourself? Do you identify yourself as a devotee? In that case, you have the bhaktirami, that Vijnani, like Sri Ramakrishna himself. Or do you have Vidyarami? But of course, Sri Ramakrishna also had Vidyarami in the sense that he's also teaching others, giving these high spiritual teachings. But in general, the Vijnani retains a certain form of I in order to stay in this world and to help others to attain spiritual enlightenment. That's how I see it. Thank you. Yes.
How would you define nirvikalpa samadhi, and what was Shankara's outlook on it?
Okay, so definition, that's difficult, but it's a spiritual state in which one realizes the sole reality of non-dual pure consciousness. And that you are non-different from that non-dual pure consciousness. So that's why I think Sri Ramakrishna, instead of defining nirvikalpa samadhi, he uses this analogy of the salt doll. The salt doll went to measure the depth of the ocean, and the moment it set foot in the ocean, it melted. That's the state of nirvikalpa samadhi. Second question is, what does Shankara have to say about it? He says very little about nirvikalpa samadhi. He rarely talks about samadhi. If you restrict Shankara's work to the commentaries on the Prasthanatraya, but many of his followers, there's a whole school of Advaita Vedanta that strongly emphasizes the necessity of nirvikalpa samadhi to attain knowledge of Brahman, and they almost equate nirvikalpa samadhi with Brahma Jnana. So there are texts like Vedanta Sara, Panchadashi, and many others. And Sri Ramakrishna was taught by Totapuri, who was an Advaitin in that yogic-oriented strain of Advaita Vedanta. So he strongly emphasized the need for constant meditation, ultimately culminating in nirvikalpa samadhi. And he would also say that nirvikalpa samadhi is necessary for Brahma Jnana. So the answer is that it's complicated because Advaita Vedanta is not monolithic. There are many different figures within Advaita Vedanta, and different Advaitins hold different views on the relative importance of nirvikalpa samadhi. Okay, we have, I guess, 2 minutes. One of these, I'll take one of the Mary Hale questions, as long as it's not too obnoxious.
Swamiji, I am still unable to digest your lecture on Mary Hale debate. Kindly help. How would you explain Swamiji's reluctance to accept a defeat? Was he egotistic? Then of what use is Brahma Jnana?
I didn't follow the first. Accept, what did you say?
Accept a defeat.
I don't know what that means. What does that mean? Defeat. Accept defeat.
Exactly.
Oh, I see. So sorry. Why did he not accept defeat? Is that the question?
Yeah. Why? How would you explain Swamiji's reluctance?
Reluctance to accept defeat.
Exactly.
I see. But I actually don't even see it as reluctance to accept defeat, because he ended up changing the way that he taught Vedanta after the debate. And that shows, as I said in my lecture, Javat Bhanti Tavashiki, it's one of Sri Ramakrishna's greatest teachings. As long as I live, so long do I learn. He so fully internalized and accepted Mary Hale's teaching that he ended up recalibrating the way that he taught Vedanta in the West to emphasize not only I am he, but also all is he, which is what Mary Hale said. Right? So I think that he didn't say in that debate, I lose, but all of his actions and his lectures betray the opposite conclusion, which is that he learned a great deal from that debate and that he incorporated the insights into his subsequent lectures. I think we should end on that note because it's 8:58, so it's quite late. So thank you very much, everyone. Om Shanti 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 Harihi Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Arpanamastu.